As discussed in earlier videos, we have made fairly rapid progress against cancer over the past few decades, but most widely metastatic cancers remain incurable. Progress against cancer is highly dependent on clinical research that translates new findings in the laboratory into clinical advances. Any factors that delay clinical research can also delay approval of effective new drugs that can alleviate suffering. Comprehensive regulation of clinical research is extremely important. It helps protect patient rights, patient safety, and the integrity of the data that are collected during the research progress to make sure that we can actually rely on that data. But the regulation also delays approval of new drugs. It delays clinical research and thereby delays the completion of clinical trials and the approval of new drugs, and also plays a direct role in driving up the cost of effective new drugs. In this video, I will discuss some of the many things that I think we need to change, that we can do effectively and safely to speed approval of effective new drugs by making clinical research much more efficient, much faster, but at the same time protecting patient patient safety, patient rights, and data integrity. My name is Dr. David Stewart. I'm a medical oncologist in Ottawa, Canada, and a professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa. And I recently wrote a book on cancer intended for patients called A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks that can be purchased online through Amazon Books. This is the 13th out of 16 videos in which I give my perspective on different things related to cancer, and you can get additional details from my book. Importantly, for your own personal health care, you should rely on your own healthcare providers for any advice about your personal health care. As I've discussed in an earlier video, there's a very extensive, comprehensive regulation covering all aspects of clinical research. This regulation is extremely important. Each of the steps that were put together in research, to govern clinical research, they were put there because of problems or issues that have arisen in the past. So we need this regulation to guide clinical research. It's very, very important. However, if you have a problem that you want to solve, there are typically many different ways to do it. And each of the potential options to solve a problem, each will have pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, costs and benefits. Nothing is perfect, but from my perspective, the clinical research regulation that's being put together does do a pretty good job of protecting patient safety, patient rights, and data integrity. However, each of the details of the regulation also comes with different costs. And again, if you do things different ways, you will end up with different costs in accomplishing the same job. From my perspective, there has not been adequate attention paid to trying to assess the cost of the way that we do things, the regulations as they're currently set up. And there have not been adequate attempts to weigh the potential for approaching things in a different way, to try to do things to maintain the same benefits of the current regulation, but at lower cost, both in delays in approval of new drugs and the prices that we ultimately must pay for the new drugs. The bottom line is that the regulation is all well-intentioned, but if it's done incorrectly, then it can actually kill by delaying access to effective new drugs. If patients cannot get access to an effective new drug because clinical research has been delayed, then lives are lost that could have been saved. In addition, if a patient could participate in a clinical trial of a new experimental drug that might be of marked benefit to them, if they cannot participate in that clinical trial because of regulation that is malfunctioning, then again, that can potentially cost lives. In addition, if the regulation drives up the cost of doing the clinical research, so that ultimately the price of the drug must be very high to pay for the cost of getting that drug developed, then governments may not buy that drug, and if they do not buy that drug for their citizens, then lives are lost because of that. So again, the regulation, if it drives up costs and results in the price of drugs being too high, that can actually indirectly kill patients. Or alternatively, if the government does agree to pay for an expensive new drug, but then the amount that is paid for that drug, those dollars cannot be used in other places in the healthcare system, so lives could be lost in other places. So high research costs can translate into high drug prices that then directly and indirectly kill patients. In addition, if it costs a very large amount to develop one new drug, then with the same resources that are available, one can then not develop additional new drugs. If it only costs a small amount, then with the same resources, you can develop many new drugs that may be effective against many problems. But if it's very expensive to develop one drug, then you cannot develop several new drugs, and so you slow progress, and that costs lives. The bottom line is that the current regulatory burden, it is harmful because of delays in access to effective new drugs, so patients cannot get access, but also because of the impact on the cost of new drugs, or the price of new drugs once they are marketed. And this is not the fault of evil, incompetent regulators. The regulators are just doing what we've asked them to do. They are doing what has been demanded of them by the public, by the press, and by politicians. If we want regulatory changes, then the public, the press, and the politicians must back the regulators in bringing about those changes that are so essential. Bottom line, there's absolutely no perfect way to do things, and everything is going to have some flaws. But just the experience with the development of AIDS drugs and COVID vaccines tells us that we can do it much faster, much more cheaply if we just decide to do it. We just have to prioritize speed. And the experience with AIDS drugs and COVID vaccines tells us that we can prioritize speed without jeopardizing patient safety. So the clinical research regulatory pathway is like a highway with thousands or hundreds of speed bumps on it. So people have asked me, well, which of the speed bumps would you tackle first? And my answer has been that you can't do it that way. If you've got a highway with hundreds of speed bumps and you just take out even the biggest speed bump, that's going to have minimal impact. The hundreds of others that are left there are still going to slow things down to far too great an extent. So we have to re-engineer the entire highway to try to clear all the speed bumps to make things move faster. So we need the equivalent of the Autobahn in Germany. The Autobahn in Germany has a very well designed highway system where the speed limits are unregulated. So you can have cars driving along at 200 kilometers an hour, 250 kilometers an hour, and doing it safely. So this Autobahn has one of the lowest traffic fatality rates in Europe, despite having unlimited speed limits. And we need the equivalent with clinical research regulation for lethal diseases. We need high speed with safety. As I discuss in my book, A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks, and as we and others have discussed in peer-reviewed academic publications, there are several things that can be done to make things much faster, much more efficient, much less expensive. Just one example, before clinical trials can be initiated in humans, then toxicity has to be first assessed in animals. And a little bit of animal toxicology is helpful and important, but the way it is currently set up is much too expensive and much too time consuming. Because much of the animal toxicology that is done, it just tells you what you would have anticipated anyway about side effects, or it predicts a side effect that ends up not being important in humans, or it misses things that are very, very important. There are very few examples where the animal toxicology has predicted something that we would not have expected and has saved lives in clinical research by doing that. There are very few examples. And we already know what we would need to do to fix this. So the examples are already there of how to make animal toxicology much faster, much less expensive, so that clinical trials can be started faster. Because because the clinical trials are delayed, if we cannot start them because of this animal toxicology that is inefficient and unnecessary, then that delays approval of effective new drugs that could save lives. Okay, one other example. To launch a clinical trial, one needs a blueprint for a blueprint called a protocol. The protocol is often 100 pages or more long, and it can take months or longer to write the protocol. But then, once it's written, then it has to be approved. And approval involves hundreds of different steps that it has to go through, and many of them are sequential, so it has to go through one before it can go through the next one. These are very time-consuming and expensive, so it can take months to years to get a study approved, a protocol approved, once it has been written. And detailed analyses of these processes have indicated very clearly that many of them are not value-added and many are duplications of effort. So there are ways to do this much faster, much more efficiently. But because of these very inefficient, wasteful, frustrating steps that must be followed, then there are delays in activating the clinical research. Therefore, there are delays in drug approval, and therefore there are lives lost. And these steps drastically increase the cost of new drug development. And if the costs of drug development are high, then the ultimate price of the drugs must be high to pay for them. When preparing the protocol, one can never get it quite right. So once one initiates a clinical trial, once we initiate one, we find that there's some things we need to change. So to make these changes, we need amendments. But we can't just go ahead and make the changes that are required. We have to write formal amendments, and then these have to be reviewed and approved. And it can take months or years to get these amendments approved. But meanwhile, the study is on hold, and patients cannot be entered on the clinical trial while these amendments are being considered. Again, this delays progress, and delays approval of effective new drugs that can save lives, and greatly increases the cost of clinical research, and thereby increases the price that we must eventually pay for these new drugs. And again, this entire review process adds little value. There are ways to do it much faster, much more safely, with very few negative impacts. We just have to get on and fix this. In addition, to put a patient in a clinical trial, the patient must meet certain eligibility criteria. And typically there are large numbers of eligibility criteria. So the majority of patients cannot meet these eligibility criteria. And many of these eligibility criteria are irrational. They don't really add anything to safety or the probability of getting the right answer in the clinical trial. But the whole process of putting patients on the clinical trial is very, very rigid. You cannot bend the rules. So the patient must meet these very, very rigid eligibility criteria, even if they are irrational. And so this means patients who want to take part in clinical trials cannot, and so they are denied access to an experimental drug that might help them. And also this slows accrual on the study, so it slows approval of effective new drugs, and it drives up costs. And again, many of these eligibility criteria are irrational, they're unnecessary. So we can and we must fix this. In addition, for the clinical trial, the regulation demands that we collect huge amounts of data. But much of the data that we are required to collect is not very helpful. It's often, much of it is never used again, and it does not contribute in a meaningful way to us knowing whether the drug is safe and effective. But it does hugely increase costs. Because of the cost of collecting that information, because it's so burdensome, an investigator cannot collect the data themselves. They have to hire people to do this. So then they need a rich source of funding so they need to hire the people. They need somebody to pay their salaries. The only source of funding to pay these people is usually drug companies. And the drug companies are generous, and the drug companies are very important for clinical research, but it means that the drug companies then drive the clinical research agenda. So we'd be much better off if we could collect these data very simply and inexpensively without requiring drug company funding to do it. In addition, because the collection of the data is so expensive, then again, this drives up greatly the cost of new drug development. And again, we have to recoup those costs later on once the drug is approved. And so this directly contributes to the very high prices that eventually must be paid for new drugs. It would be different if all of this information was essential, if all of it directly contributed to patient safety and to us knowing how well a drug works, but much of it is unnecessary. So I could keep on going on and on. I'm very passionate about this whole area. I could keep going on and on. If you want to see more details, again, just look at our book, A Short Primer on Why Cancer Still Sucks. That can be purchased online through Amazon Books, or look at one of our many peer-reviewed academic publications, or those of other authors that agree with me that things must change. As I stated previously, the regulation is absolutely essential. It's very, very, very important. Without it, then there will be big problems. But it can be much better put together. It can be much more efficient, much less expensive. But the regulators can only make the changes that are needed if the public and the press and the politicians permit them to do it, and back them in doing this. So all of us need to participate in fixing this. From my perspective, this is urgent because patients are dying because of delayed access to effective new drugs, because it takes too long to do the clinical trials. And the prices we're paying for these new drugs are far too high because conducting clinical trials, clinical research is much too expensive because of this. And we need to bring down the price of effective new drugs by bringing down the cost of new drug development. So this is not just an American problem or a Canadian problem. This is an international problem because clinical research approaches are harmonized internationally, so that we need to all tackle this together. And if you agree with me in this, then please then talk to your elected representatives to tell them that you want this fixed, and also talk to the press about this. This is something that is extremely important. So I hope that you found this video helpful, and that this has been helped you understand some of the issues that we are facing in trying to get effective new drugs to patients rapidly. Thank you.